We tell boys to be strong, to stand on their own, to keep their feelings in check. And then we wonder why decades later, so many men are isolated and angry and aching for connection that they don't even know how to create. You see, we trained them for this, not on purpose, but through a million tiny reinforcements and punishments, silences, and even shames that resulted in a generation of men who are fluent in performance, but illiterate in connection. And many of them don't even know it. This is not a takedown. It's a wake-up call because loneliness doesn't just hurt the person who's feeling it. It actually reshapes society itself. In this episode, we're going to dig into how men are conditioned into loneliness, what it costs them and those around them, and how we can start reclaiming connection back through integrity and intimacy. But let's begin at the beginning, shall we? In childhood. Because this is a really good place for us to consider how boys are trained out of connection. You see, from the moment that they're old enough to fall down, boys are often coached not to feel, not to show pain, not to even reach out for care. I mean, think about it. A boy scrapes his knee and he's told, "You're fine, be tough." He cries after being hurt and he's mocked and he's told, "Don't be a baby." He asks for a hug and he's teased. "You need to man up," they say. And what seems like casual banter is actually early training that's repeated thousands of times in these interactions that teach boys that needing emotional support is embarrassing, that asking for help makes you less of a man, and that pain is something to hide. And then, and then they grow up in school environments where emotional expression is often dismissed, where empathy is labeled as soft, and where boys bond through aggression and teasing instead of tenderness. And by the time they reach adolescence, many boys have already started that emotional withdrawal. The friendships that used to feel open and affectionate now become rigid, and play is replaced by performative masculinity, and vulnerability becomes dangerous because it makes you a target. And friendships begin to narrow. Expressions of affection get filtered through sarcasm or competition, and emotional literacy declines. This is where loneliness starts. Not because boys don't want closeness, but because they're actively taught that closeness is risky. And then there's the emotional literacy, which is a, a silent epidemic that we're going through. I mean, we talk about literacy in school, like reading and writing and math and all the other things, but emotional literacy, the ability to name and express and navigate one's feelings, is often ignored, especially for boys. A boy grows up feeling anxious and disappointed and overwhelmed, but no one helps him name those emotions. No one gives him language for expressing them. And so he doesn't process. He doesn't ask for support. He instead learns to bury them. And the result is he grows into a man who doesn't know what he's feeling, just that something feels wrong, and he may become reactive or he may go silent, he may be aloof or cold, but underneath he's emotionally flooded without a map. This is not stupidity. This is social conditioning. You see, most men weren't taught to say, "I feel hurt," or "I'm scared," or "I need reassurance." Instead, they learn to act out their emotions through withdrawal, anger, humor, or even shutting down. Without a language for emotional experience, men can't build relational bridges. They can't repair when there's a rupture in the relationship. They don't know how to express their needs in ways that creates connection. And oftentimes, they end up feeling emotionally alone, even in the relationships that are supposed to be intimate. And then, of course, there's performance that is prioritized over being present. You see, when authenticity feels dangerous, performance becomes a survival mechanism. Men aren't taught to perform for success, for admiration, for status, for approval. They learn that who they are matters less than what it is that they do. And so they become the funny one, the reliable one, the smart one, the strong one. They lead with roles and achievements, but rarely do they lead with their self. And this creates a heartbreaking trap because they crave being loved, but only feel safe when showing the mask. And so even if someone does love them, they question if it's the mask that's being loved or if it's the man. And this performance mindset is reinforced everywhere, right? In dating, where being desirable feels like a competition. In your workplace, where vulnerability is punished and bravado is rewarded. In friendship contexts, where emotional depth can feel off limits. And underneath the performance is often a scared boy who just wants to be known. But he's learned very early on that being real gets you hurt. So he hides, and every time he hides, that sense of loneliness deepens. You see, loneliness doesn't always look lonely. One of the hardest things about male loneliness is that it doesn't always look like what we expect it to. Sometimes it looks like overworking. Other times it looks like sarcasm. And sometimes it even looks like confidence. At other times, it even looks like anger expressed in rage. But loneliness gets disguised. It gets disguised as busyness. When you say, I just have a lot on my plate right now. It gets disguised as emotional control. When you say, I'm fine, it's not a big deal. Or it gets disguised as detachment. When you say, I'm just not a needy person. But underneath those facades is often an aching for closeness that feels unreachable, a hunger for that connection that has no safe outlet. And this is why loneliness in men can be so invisible because many don't even realize that that's what they're experiencing in the first place. All they know is that life just feels flat and relationships aren't fulfilling and the world feels indifferent and instead of reaching out, they retreat further inward. And over time, that retreat becomes a prison. Now, shame is at the very root of this whole system. You see, to understand male loneliness, we have to understand shame. Shame tells you, shame tells you that you're not enough. Shame says your emotions are too much. Shame says your needs are embarrassing and your sensitivity is unacceptable. And most boys absorb shame before they can even name it. They're taught that fear and sadness and tenderness are unmanly, that being emotional makes you a liability, and that needing someone is a form of failure. So what do? Well, the only logical thing is to hide for them. They don't just hide though from others, they start hiding from themselves as well. See, shame creates this internal fragmentation, and men become disconnected from their own inner lives. And they may not feel ashamed consciously, but it drives them into silence. It tells them, don't speak. Don't speak up, don't ask for help, don't need anyone. Just handle it yourself or disappear. And so they vanish, not physically per se, but emotionally. They show up in bodies, in routines, in responsibilities, but their deeper selves remain tucked away, far away, unseen and untouched. That's not stoicism, that's self-erasure. And then there's punishment for vulnerability. You see, when a boy is vulnerable and gets mocked, that memory stays. And when he reaches out for connection and is met with cruelty or ridicule, that moment is imprinted. And over time, he learns, I better not do that again. So men become cautious. They become hypervigilant. They scan for risks before they open up. They fear being seen as weak, needy, or even too much. Even in adult relationships, many men don't just fear rejection, they fear exposure. They've been conditioned to expect that if they show who they really are, the result is most likely going to be distance or derision. And the pain of that potential rejection becomes worse than the loneliness that they already know and are familiar with. And so they stay silent, and then they wear an armor and they tell half-truths, not because they don't want closeness, but because they've learned the cost of closeness might be humiliation. And this is why so many men struggle to be vulnerable, even with people that they trust. The risk does not feel theoretical, it feels real. And so intimacy feels foreign. See, for men raised in environments where connection was conditional, true intimacy can feel really strange, almost alien. And when someone offers genuine care, it may trigger suspicion. When someone says, I see you, it might prompt panic. Why is this? This is because the nervous system doesn't know how to hold that or how to receive that or how to interact with that. If your entire emotional world has been shaped by keeping people out, then letting someone in does not feel safe. It feels destabilizing. And so many men, they sabotage that sense of closeness. They don't do it intentionally, but almost instinctively. They might withdraw when things get tender. They might joke to deflect the emotional depth. They might pick fights to create more distance. They might numb out or check out when emotions begin to rise. And all of this is a defense mechanism against unfamiliar intimacy. And ironically, many men crave closeness and fear it at the same time. They long to be seen, but they don't know how to be tolerated without being witnessed. And that's not emotional immaturity. That's unpracticed capacity. And there's also the social acceptability of numbness that we live in. In many cultures, a man who is stoic or withdrawn or emotionally indifferent is not only tolerated, he's respected. So we will call him chill. We say he's low maintenance. We admire his unflappability. But what if that calm exterior is just disconnection in disguise? What if numbness has become the only socially acceptable emotional state? Men are rarely rewarded for being emotionally expressive, but they're often praised for being composed or distant or emotionally detached. This creates a pervasive incentive. The more emotionally unavailable you are, the more socially comfortable you make others around you feel. But inside, that unavailability becomes a cage. And many men don't know how to come back to feeling, to feeling sensation and presence. They may seem fine, but they're walking through life like ghosts that are untouched by intimacy, unheld by others, and often unanchored within themselves. And then, of course, we have to consider the romantic pressure cooker that they experience as well. You see, for many men, romantic relationships become the only socially acceptable place to seek deep emotional connection. But that creates a massive problem because When your romantic partner is the only source of intimacy in your life, the stakes become unbearable. You, you don't just want love, you also need this person to be your emotional anchor, your confidant, your caretaker, your therapist, your best friend, your healer, and you're basically your everything. And that's not sustainable. This kind of pressure, it often overwhelms romantic relationships. It breeds resentment, and codependence is an outcome, and emotional burnout, especially if the one partner, which is often the woman, is expected to do all the heavy lifting of the emotional labor that's expected. And when men don't have strong friendships and family bonds or even community care, romantic partnerships get overlooked. And when those relationships break, it can feel like everything breaks because there is no backup system for the emotional sense of belonging. And that's when some men spiral into bitterness or even into incel ideology or utterly into despair because their whole sense of self-worth was tied to whether someone chose them. And then we go from longing for these beautiful experiences of connection to loathing in the absence of them. You see, when the desire for love goes unmet too long, it often just disappears and it begins to curdle. And longing turns into resentment, and hope turns into cynicism. Vulnerability will often turn into contempt. And men who once wanted to be loved begin to believe that they are unlovable. And from that belief system, some conclude that the system is rigged, that women are the problem, and that romance is ultimately a lie. And so they armor themselves with this sense of detachment, with irony, or even an ideology. But you see, at the root of what they're carrying is grief. Grief for the love they never received, the friendships that faded, the emotions that they buried. They care, the care that they craved, but were never taught how to receive. And unprocessed grief over time, it becomes a poison, not just inwardly, but it expresses itself outwardly as well. This is the emotional fuel of many incel narratives. Not just the rejection, but the profound, unacknowledged grief that makes no safe place to land. And so the masculinity feedback becomes a loop. When men act emotionally distant, they often get rewarded for it, especially by other men. They're called cool or chill or independent. They don't need anything. They seem self-contained. Meanwhile, men who express emotional needs or even vulnerability are often criticized or made fun of. You're too sensitive, or grow up, or don't be so dramatic are some of the responses. This dynamic creates a feedback loop. When you express a need, you're punished. When you withhold needs, you are praised. So guess what gets repeated? Even men who want to be more open quickly learn that the social cost of doing so is not good. They're discouraged not just by individual reactions, but by an entire masculine culture that upholds emotional stoicism as the ideal. And over time, this loop becomes internalized. A man no longer needs to be mocked by others. Instead, he does it to himself. He hears his own voice say, don't say that, don't show that, don't even feel that. And so he becomes his own emotional gatekeeper, his own warden in his own prison. But there's a price of isolation that isn't always immediate, isn't there? You see, loneliness rarely shows up all at once. For many men, it builds slowly over years, even decades. And so you stop reaching out, You skip the hangouts, you lose touch with friends, you default to work or video games or porn or gym routines, and nothing seems wrong. I mean, you're functioning, you're busy, you're not in crisis mode, but something feels off. And you start to feel less alive, less connected to the world around you, less understood, less seen. And then one day, it hits you. You don't really have anyone you could call at 2 a.m. or someone who would notice if you disappeared for a week. And that realization doesn't come with fireworks. It comes in the silence, a quiet awareness that you've become emotionally invisible. And by the time it registers, the path back to connection feels long and foggy. But it's not too late. It never is too late. You see, the myth of the emotionally strong man needs to be considered. When you hear things like be a rock or don't let them see you sweat, right? Or don't take things so personally. These are the mantras, if you will, that many boys are raised up with. And the message beneath them is this: emotions make you weak. But let's be clear, emotional suppression is not strength. It's survival. And over time, it becomes self-harm. True emotional strength is being able to feel without being consumed, to be affected without losing your core, to cry and stand tall, to be tender and still be powerful. The idea that real men are unshakable is not only false, it is dangerous because it disconnects men from their humanity. You don't become less of a man by feeling. You become more of a human. And that's what the world really needs. Not less humanity, but more humanity on display. See, when friendship becomes foreign, we need to address that as well. For many men, the last time they had emotionally rich, daily affirming friendships was in their childhood. They had best friends then. They saw these best friends every day. The friends that they told their secrets to, the friends that they hugged and laughed with and cried out loud with. But as puberty hit, those friendships became thinner. Competition replaced connection. And shared vulnerability was replaced with shared banter. And physical affection, that was gone. By adulthood, many men have friendships that are based on shared activities like sports or work or games, but not shared selves. And so they feel emotionally hungry in relationships that look full from the outside. But the tragedy is that male friendships can be deeply nourishing, but we've lost the map. And we rarely see models that show us how to find that again. And so we settle for proximity without presence, for friendship without intimacy, and our souls will shrink back in silence. Now, here's why romantic relationships can't fix all of these issues. A lot of men treat the romantic connections, like I said, like a magic fix for their loneliness. They say, if I just had a girlfriend, everything would be okay. But this mindset sets everyone up for failure because no one person can meet all of your emotional needs, especially if you've never learned how to meet those needs in community or in friendships or even in yourself. You see, when men expect romantic partners to be their everything, it creates fragility and pressure. And it's why some relationships fail, not because of incompatibility, but because they were asked to do more than one human can actually handle. We need to relearn collective connection, shared spaces and male friendships, emotional support systems that are beyond romance. Because when love is the lifeboat rather than a network, it's going to sink under that weight. There's also a shame of wanting too much that we should talk about. You see, one of the most heartbreaking beliefs that many men carry is this: I'm too much, or I'm too emotional, I'm too needy, I'm too intense. We need to ask, where did they learn this? See, often from rejection and from being ghosted and from being told to chill, from people who label them as clingy for expressing desire or depth. And so as a result, they internalize the belief that wanting connection is a burden, that needing someone to check in, to care, to stay is asking for too much. And so they shut down their needs before anyone else can do it for them. And they pretend not to care. They lower their expectations. They convince themselves that being emotionally self-sufficient is the goal that they ought to strive for. But deep down there's this longing, a longing where they're afraid to name, because if they do and it's not returned, they don't know how to survive that kind of pain again. This isn't about weakness. It's about the cost of being repeatedly unmet in a culture that teaches you not to speak up about it. Now, here's what it looks like when connection feels unsafe. There's this other layer that we don't talk about enough, and that's trauma. Many men have experienced emotional neglect and bullying and abandonment and even abuse. And for them, connection isn't just unfamiliar, it actually feels dangerous. They don't just avoid vulnerability because of pride. They avoid it because it feels like exposure to harm. If you've only known relationships of places of betrayal, especially of humiliation and of punishment, why would you ever run back to that kind of fire? This is why telling men to just open up can feel tone deaf, because some are trying, but their nervous system is saying, protect at all costs. And for those men, connection has to be rebuilt in safe environments with patient people through small, consistent moments of safety. It's not about being fixed. It's more about learning to feel safe, safe enough to be a human again. And here's why incels feel like they're the ones who are speaking the truth. See, to someone on the outside, the incel ideology, it can sound bitter and hateful or irrational. But to someone who has lived inside the kind of loneliness that we've just described, it can sound like the only voice that actually understands them. Many incels are not driven to anger because they hate women. They're instead driven to despair because they believe that they'll never be wanted by anyone. They don't see themselves as lovable. They see themselves instead as defective. And when that shame goes unchallenged long enough, it starts looking for explanations. If I'm not wanted, they say, someone must be to blame. And that's where resentment enters. Not as a cause, but as a consequence of long-term disconnection and perceived invisibility. We're not excusing harmful behavior, by the way, but we are naming that loneliness that left untreated often mutates into grievance. And grievance, when it's left unaddressed, it hardens into an ideology. Now, here is the role that integrity plays in rebuilding connection. So what do we do? And where can this healing come from? considering all that we've said so far? I believe it starts with integrity, not just the moral virtue, but that deep alignment between your inner values and the outer life that you live. Integrity says, I won't hide who I am in order to fit in. I won't pretend not to care. I won't perform connection. I will pursue connection rather with honesty. When men begin to align their values, their desires, and their actions, something powerful begins to happen, and that is trust begins to rebuild. They begin to trust themselves, and others begin to trust them, and relationships start gaining solid ground. Integrity doesn't just mean perfection, it means a congruence. It's saying, I'm allowed to want closeness. I'm allowed to feel, and I will not trade authenticity for approval anymore. This is the foundation of all real connection. And then there's a power of intimacy that can be experienced even in small doses. You see, next after integrity comes intimacy, not as romance per se, but as emotional closeness. Intimacy says things like, intimacy. That's how we define it. It's not about constant disclosure. It's about intentional visibility, about sharing one honest thought instead of holding it. It's about naming one fear without apologizing for having named it. It's about letting someone see behind the performance for just a moment. These are a small acts, if you will, of rebellion against isolation. And when it's done with people who are safe and capable, they begin to rewire everything in your experience, because intimacy teaches the nervous system you can be seen and still be safe. That's the antidote to trained loneliness. Learning to practice connection and not just desire it is a critical component here. You see, connection isn't a feeling, it's a practice. You don't just want to connect, you have to learn how to do it. It's a skill set. It requires active listening and naming needs without shame. It requires making invitations without trying to control, or repairing after a conflict has been experienced. Sitting with discomfort instead of trying to run away or escape from it. These are the muscles, not the magic. And the tragedy is, most men have never been taught how to build these skills. And so when connection fails, they assume that they're broken. And they're not broken, they're just unpracticed. And practice is always possible. But community is a necessary antidote to this collapse that we're addressing. One of the biggest lies of male loneliness is that you're alone in the midst of it. But look around. There are millions of men who are silently suffering and waiting for someone else to speak first. This is why community matters. Not just for support, but for modeling. Men need to see other men being tender, other men being open and being honest and loving each other without shame. They need to feel what it feels like to belong to something that doesn't require performance to earn your place there. Building these kinds of communities isn't just a nice idea. It's a necessary intervention in a world that's unraveling from disconnection. Because when men find each other, something ancient is restored. This is a message to the men who are still in hiding. Listen closely. To the man who's listening to this who feels like it's too late for him, it's not. You're not too old. You're not too numb. You're not too weird. You're not too damaged. You're not too far gone. You're just under practiced in how to be known. And that's all it is. And you don't have to start with everything. You just have to start with one thing. And that one thing is maybe try a real text or one brave share. Try one truth that you speak out loud instead of swallowing. And if it doesn't land well, don't let that be the end. I mean, keep practicing, keep risking. This takes courage, doesn't it? Because one day someone will see you and they'll stay, and your body will learn that you were never unlovable, just unseen. And to those of you who love lonely men, if you're someone who loves a man who's struggling to connect, I want you to remember this. He may not be pushing you away out of indifference. He may be doing it out of terror. His silence might be shame being expressed, and his distance might be fear. His detachment might be learned survival mechanisms. And your job is not to fix him, but your presence matters more than you know. So keep creating spaces where softness is safe, and keep asking questions without judgment. Keep showing him that love doesn't always demand performance. And protect your own heart as well, because you deserve reciprocity. You deserve connection that flows in two directions. This is not about self-sacrifice. It's instead about co-creating safety so that healing becomes possible. Because the series is called The Bridge Back to Us. You see, we began this conversation talking about trained loneliness, right? The idea that boys are raised to disconnect, that men are taught not to feel, and that masculinity, as it's currently constructed, often leads to emotional exile. But that doesn't have to be the end of the story. There is a bridge back to oneself, a bridge back to others in community, a bridge back to experiencing wholeness. And this bridge is built with honesty, with courage, with integrity, with intimacy. And you don't have to know how to cross it all at once. You just have to take one step, and then another, and then another. We're not here to diagnose men as broken. We're here to see them as aching. To believe that every man who's been trained to be alone still holds that capacity to connect. And that healing is not just possible, it's waiting.